So now I wanted to move on to the second part of the talk, which is about consciousness. So I was really curious about this topic when I was in college. And I remember in the early 90s, I used to spend a lot of time at the bookstore. You know, I think you're quite naive when you're young. Like I certainly was, just like, oh, what happens when you die? You know, go to the bookstore, see what you can find. What's consciousness? So one day I was thrilled. There was actually a brand new book called Consciousness Explained. And I was like, great. I had very little money. You know, I think I only had like $100 extra a month of spending money. So I was like, I'm buying this book. I need to know what consciousness is. It was by this guy named Dennett, pretty famous, philosopher. But, and I read through the whole thing, and I was really puzzled when I finished the book, because at the end of it, his conclusion seemed to deny that we have any conscious experience at all. And I did not get it. I was sort of like, shaking the book. Like, what is this? What does he say? He didn't explain consciousness at all. And he basically said, it doesn't really exist. It's just an illusion. So, and then later I actually found out, much, much later, that a lot of other people shared my bewilderment, and that a lot of his critics joke that his book should have been called Consciousness Explained Away, And many people disagree with him, especially Anil Seth, this fantastic science consciousness researcher. So denying our subjective experience seems really senseless to me for, I think, quite obvious reasons, because it's the one thing that each of us knows for certain is that we exist and we're aware, right? In a sense, that's the only thing we know absolutely for certain, is that we have our subjective experience, because anything seemingly objective is coming through those senses, right? So it seemed really ridiculous. And he's sorry to call him out by name, but I really felt like that was nonsense. And lately there's much more subtle thought about this in philosophy and in Western philosophy and in consciousness research. There's a philosopher named David Chalmers who has named this problem, and he calls it the hard problem of consciousness, which I bet some of you have heard about. And that's the question of how certain processes we observe in the brain, like neurons firing and blood flowing, how those relate to our subjective conscious experiences of color and music and joy. And he's very humble. He basically says, we do not know. This is like literally the hardest problem of consciousness, is to explain that. We have no explanation right now. Buddhism does have some explanations, though, which we'll talk about. So Buddhism relies heavily on subjective experience to establish its models for consciousness. And one of the key reasons for Buddhists wanting to understand consciousness is to gain access to its subtler levels. That's that experience I had with Venerable Rene, that meditation retreat, where you discover a non-conceptual sense of who you are that lies beneath perception, thought, and even personality. Certainly beneath your job and so on. And so you do this not just for the adventure. It is actually quite a fun adventure, and not just out of curiosity, but because knowledge like this can leave you with a lasting wellspring of inner happiness, like a place you can go to on your own whenever you want, to bring you a sense of joy and refuge, like they call it in Buddhism. So I want to talk about there's a concept in Mahayana Buddhism of the continuity of mind, and that's a conviction that your mind has existed forever, although it's constantly changing. It's not like an unchanging phenomenon, but your mind has existed in this constant stream of change forever, and it will continue to live on forever. And because of this, if you have this conviction, that you feel a responsibility to evolve this ever-changing mind toward happiness and wisdom and connection, and compassion also. So, as I think a lot of you know, I run an organization called the Skeptics Path to Enlightenment that tries to take as much of the authentic Buddhist teachings, but share them in a secular way, like a way that you don't have to believe in things that science can't prove today. So, if you don't believe in this vast, infinite timescale for your existence, is it still possible to conjure up the same sense of awe and responsibility in your practice. I think this was, I actually almost skipped over this topic when I started it with my partner, Stephen Butler, and he's like, no, you really have to figure this out. And I, talked to my teachers and so on. But one method that's worked for me with non-Buddhist meditators is to look at the present moment, actually. Instead of infinite past, infinite future, infinite lives, to just look at the present moment down to its most subtle level and to have an experience of the mind right now without worrying about its existence before or after that moment. And there are many ways to break through to this subtler aspect of mind, and this is the 1 minute Mahamudra part of the talk. I'm going to share a few of them right now, each of them with a guided meditation. And as I mentioned, normally these like nature of mind practices are undertaken by advanced practitioners. In fact, a lot of what's taught in Buddhism was very secret. We live in a very fortunate era where all of these teachings are so accessible, mostly because they were so worried about them disappearing completely. So they're trying to share them as widely as they can and document them in books. But like I mentioned, I found that curious, analytically minded people, like the people who would come to a talk like this, can respond really well to these methods. And they often achieve very powerful direct experiences of the subtle nature of the mind very early in a meditation journey. And I don't say that as some, false promise or something. You may not have that experience. But Venerable Rene and Rob Priest, who's an extraordinary teacher here in the UK, and Lama Yeshe especially, talked about sharing the benefits of these practices early in the path for exactly this reason. So it wasn't my idea. So I'm gonna go through very brief explanations and meditations on these different ways of viewing the mind, with the hope that making them so succinct can make them easier to practice in spare moments during your day to get in touch with your deeper nature. I think we can build up a big story of not being able to meditate or not find the right place, or I'm too tired, I'm too busy in the morning, too tired at night, too busy during my day. But I'm actually going to show like 1 minute. You can find 1 minute. You could stay in the bathroom for an extra minute, afterwards, or or if you're in your car or something like that. These are short enough that you could squeeze them into a minute that you might otherwise be, reading your phone on Facebook or something like that. So one Buddhist definition of the mind is that it's clear and knowing. This is a very well-known model of the mind. And a simple way to explain this is that the clarity of your mind is its ability to model the world within your consciousness, to create that model in your mind. And then the knowing aspect of your mind is its power to understand and engage with that mental model. There's other ways of explaining it, but that's just a simple way of doing it. And so as you start to recognize and observe these two aspects of your mind, you become more attuned to the encompassing awareness in which both of these aspects arise. So you might have noticed that so far these meditations on consciousness haven't asked or even answered the hard question of how consciousness relates to the brain. And in Buddhism, consciousness is generally viewed as immaterial, that it continues on in some form after the body dies. That's the Buddhist view. And then there's another, very strong opposite view for scientific materialists. Have the strong view that everything has a material cause, which we don't have proof for that. That's also a belief today. And so for those type of scientists, they say that consciousness is just a side effect of neurons firing, and that it disappears at the time of death, which is a totally reasonable perspective too, given what we understand about reality today. But without admitting to anything supernatural, there are scientists that take a position between these two extremes, particularly like Anil Seth. And they say that the information that flows through neurons does have a reality apart from them. And this perspective, like when you say that, you start to get really critical, which is actually, some people start to get very critical, which is totally fine. But it's not saying that there's something beyond, outside of the neurons, like something separate from the neurons that is your consciousness. I actually like to use the analogy of computer software. I'm a software engineer, computer scientist in training. And I like to talk about this because it's quite. I don't think it's much different than saying that computer software is separate from computer hardware. Like we say that today. We say there's a software and the hardware, but software is completely dependent on the circuits and the semiconductors and so on. And yet we have no problem believing in the Microsoft Word and so on. We don't say it's some supernatural phenomena. So I really like software as this analogy for mental activity, because no one debates whether software exists. Like, you laugh, right? But you don't laugh when you say, like, oh, does my consciousness really exist, or does it continue after life, and so on. So yet software doesn't have a literal material form. So it's a lot like thought. Software is just a constantly changing stream of information that flows through computer hardware and input and output devices, the human minds that are perceiving and changing them. But we'd never say that software is merely the hardware it runs on or the memory that it's stored in. And yet we don't get mystical and claim that software is a metaphysical phenomenon, right? Software is just this dynamically changing immaterial information. Like, you don't have to get supernatural to say something's immaterial. But the problem is that the word immaterial really can make a lot of people uncomfortable. And when we hear it, a lot of us assume that it refers to something religious or supernatural. But like software and information, science and psychology already accept many immaterial phenomena. And I like to give a couple of examples, because we may not realize it. So mathematics is immaterial. Whether it's arithmetic, algebra, the equations that underpin reality, mathematics doesn't literally exist. Mathematics isn't on the worksheets that you did in school. And mathematics also doesn't exist in the fundamental forces of nature, even though we use mathematics to model them. But mathematics functions. It can solve problems, it can make predictions, it can describe physical reality better than words. And there's a physicist I really love named David Deutsch who argues this very forcefully. He says, the laws of physics are not themselves physical objects. It's a very, very beautiful, profound, and true quote. So, math is immaterial, but it's real. And then on a sweeter note, the people who aren't as much into math, we all believe in love, right? But love isn't material either. Where do you find love? Sorry. Is it in your brain? Is it in your body? Is it in a love letter? Is it in the sound of the words, I love you? When a heart emoji pops up on your phone, is the love in the red and pink pixels of that little symbol? So there's no such thing as a math. You have to say maths in the UK. So I say math. There's no such thing as a mathematics detector or a love detector. Just like we don't have consciousness detectors. Yet we accept the existence of the immaterial phenomena of mathematics and love, not just because they're useful in understanding our world, but also because they feel real to us. So saying that the mind has an existence apart from the brain doesn't require a supernatural belief in a soul. I think it's really important, because I think it's a lot of our cultural, the way we were raised, that makes us rush to this supernatural ideas. It just means that the activity of the mind isn't identical to the physical components of the brain. That's all. It's just that the mind's constantly changing immaterial information and the brain's hardware are interdependent. Like, that's it. They're interdependent in ways that we don't yet fully understand. So some people sometimes use the word spiritual to refer to these immaterial aspects of reality, and I really like this definition. And when I use the word spiritual myself, that's what I mean. It's defining spiritual not in any religious or supernatural sense, but instead as this common sense understanding that there's more to existence than material reality. That's all. And if you like, if you're kind of nerdy, you can just call it information. But from this subjective perspective of consciousness, we find the spiritual reality in our minds. Okay, so that's what is the mind.